Okay. Welcome back, everyone. We are heading towards the end. It's been a weird semester, to say the least. I have a series of announcements about, how we're going to do the rest of this class, and so on and so forth. So first of all, about Packback, there aren't any more Packback discussion posts that will be due this semester. However, if you missed one over the last few weeks, which is very understandable, you can make those up. So if you say you missed 2 weeks worth, that means you would post 2 questions and respond to 4 other posts. So you can kind of do the math if you've missed some in the past. I'm aware that these are very historic and chaotic times. Other things, so the final exam, some people have asked what's on the final exam, will it be cumulative, and so on. So the final exam will not be cumulative, it will cover Chapter 18, which I'll be going over this week. Chapter 18 is on sexuality and health. So how this is going to work is I'll talk about sexuality today. On Wednesday, I'll have a video, available for you to watch to give me some more time to kind of finish up the lectures. So what I'll be doing this on Friday and then next week will be kind of figuring out ways to connect the readings connected to some of the material we've discussed in the class. So there won't be a lot of new material that I'll be introducing in those lectures, maybe a little bit. But what I'll really be doing then is kind of talking about healthcare and health in Chapter 18, connecting it, and I'll never get tired of connecting that pun to the book Connected. Anyway, and I'll be connecting that to not only Connected and social networks, the social networks that are discussed there, but also Christakis's new book, Blueprint. There's some very interesting stuff there that talks about how our friendship networks have formed as a way in which to contain infectious disease, interestingly enough. So I'm going to talk about that. I think there's some very relevant stuff there. As you're locked down, and as we head into the summer and maybe you're bored and looking for something to do, you're more interested in this subject, I'd recommend getting Blueprint, his most recent book. It's kind of takes Connected, to the next step, to the next level, basically. Like the quote in the book, the things that we share in this world are far more valuable than the things which divide us. Okay, so as I said, I'll be talking about networks and health then really for the rest of the semester. We'll have the papers graded and posted next week. Just give, the TAs and myself some time. For the most part, they've looked pretty good. As I said today, I'll talk about sexuality. I'll also be posting a short little video about Kinsey and his research on sexuality that the book discusses in more detail. And as I said, next week I'll be kind of connecting the stuff we've talked about, social networks, to what's going on in the world. As I said, I had, originally planned on doing this anyway. It just turns out that the world changed quite dramatically, more than I expected. And interestingly enough, Nicholas Christakis is really at the forefront of studying this. In fact, he's developing an app to help combat COVID-19 that may help us restart the economy and so on. So anyway, COVID-19, we're going to need sociology to help us figure out what's going to happen in the coming months and years ahead. So we're seeing a lot of world change. A lot of this is happening and disrupting social networks. What does this mean for globalization? What does this mean for surveillance capitalism? Companies like Google, Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, etc. have never been more powerful or more influential. Amazon, for example, and so on. Are we seeing new forms of solidarity? Remember Durkheim talked about mechanical and organic solidarity. Are we seeing new forms of solidarity emerge? And are we seeing other forms break down? It's hard to say. These are very weird times that we're living in. But anyway, so today I'll talk about sexuality, and as I said, it'll be somewhat short lecture. You can watch a video on the Kinsey experiment that will be posted online, and then I'll continue with healthcare on Friday specifically, and I think I'll post some stuff for Wednesday. Okay. Now I need to go here. All right. So sexuality, the fun stuff. The first thing to say about sexuality is that it's complex, and it's kind of like gender. Sometimes people will say that, it's very easy. Gender is a very easy thing. You have biological males and biological females, and I always say be careful about making biological arguments, because biology is much more complicated than we often realize. And that's certainly true with sexuality. Interestingly, just sort of an aside on the sort of neuroscience here, a lot of the stuff that happens in our brains when we're sort of, behaving sexually is the same thing that happens in our brains when we're behaving aggressively. So there's some interesting links there in sort of the sociobiology, but I'm not going to get into that today or in this class, but you can sort of follow that on your own if you'd like to. So, really today's lecture, I'm primarily going to be talking about LGBTQ rights, homosexuality, talked about gender inequality, and more or less in the context of heterosexuality. Sorry, just watching this family of rabbits out my window that, I never get to see. Anyway, okay. We'll primarily be talking about, homosexuality and, non-heterosexual types of sexuality and genders and so on. So this is a map looking at the world of homosexual acts that were banned. There's some that are in places that have currently have bans. We also have countries that have recently legalized homosexuality. Some places where homosexual acts had been legal going back to the 1960s. And you see that's much of Latin America, parts of Western Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, Europe, and so on. Kind of interesting there. But then you also see parts of particularly the Middle East, South Asia, parts of Sub-Saharan and North Africa, where you have homosexual acts that are still banned. So a lot of progress has been made in terms of the human rights here, but as you can see, there's still a lot of oppression going on around the world. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over these definitions, sexual orientation, who you're sexually attracted to, and so on. Heterosexuality refers to predominance of sexual attraction to people of the opposite sex. Homosexuality, people of the same sex. Now we know that, homosexuality has been observed in, I believe, about at least 300 or 400 different species. And, the theory used to be that, well, this only happens in zoos because you've got two males enclosed and they have no females to have sex with, and that's why you see it in wild animals. And then people started actually seeing it happen, quite frequently in the wild. And now we know, beyond a doubt that, homosexuality is natural. In fact, there's been, very interesting, biological research, sociobiological research on homosexuality and the evolutionary reasons for it, which are kind of interesting. And again, sort of go beyond what I want to get into here. But again, the sociobiology is really making some interesting leaps and bounds in our understanding of sort of the role that homosexuality has played. its functional role. If you think of it in terms of functionalism, the role that it has played in keeping societies stable. Not necessarily social attitudes, but from a sort of ecological, mathematical, evolutionary perspective. And then, as I said, sexuality is is often described as being a spectrum. Where you have a lot of bisexuality, people who have sexual attraction to members of both sexes. And you can get into the psychology of sexuality much more deeply, and then I was a psychology major in college, and I wanted to be a therapist for a long time for people who had been victims of sexual abuse when they were younger. And in the sort of the classes I remember taking for that, learning about just the wide plethora of different sexual practices and desires that people have, and so on and so forth. Started realizing that perhaps, it's hard to become judgmental when you see such a range in terms of human sexual behavior, which is very interesting. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of interesting research that has been done in this area. So, what are the percentages of people who are homosexual and bisexual and so on and so forth? It's actually much lower than people think. For a long time, I think, and I'm not quite sure where this number came from, but for a long time, and a lot of people still think this way, but for a long time, the number was being thrown around that 10% of the population was gay. Then it was 5%. And now we know that it's probably, it's much lower than that it's, 3% of males, maybe 2% of women, maybe it's a percentage or two higher than that. At the same time, we see that more people are identifying as queer, as non-binary in their gender expression. Now, I think it's, we're still in sort of early days and kind of understanding our own sexuality here. But my understanding of our understanding is that there's sort of a difference in terms of gender expression and sexual attraction. There are many more people who are expressing androgyny and non-binary characteristics, while at the same time still having what you would consider a heterosexual attraction and that sort of thing. So anyway, I think we're starting to have a better understanding of the demographics in terms of homosexuality, bisexuality, and so on. So as I said, functionalists historically were, for the most part, in favor of the nuclear family, heterosexual marriages, and so on and so forth. Today, functionalists would say that, it doesn't really necessarily matter so much if it's a gay couple or a heterosexual couple, as long as it's a loving couple or a loving family, that sort of thing. We've seen a big difference, go over here, a big change in terms of why people think, the reasons people ascribe for homosexuality. Look back in the late 1970s. So I was born in the early 1980s, so this chart starts a few years before I was born. And back then, most people thought that homosexuality was a choice. It was a consequence of socialization, of the environment that a person was raised in. Keep getting distracted by all this wildlife that's outdoors. Okay, anyway, sorry. So people thought that, it's all socialization, this is something people learn, and so on and so forth. And, that's changed. And really over the last, as we've started to have a better understanding of, just how much biology plays a role in so many aspects of our behavior, now, a pretty healthy majority now believe that homosexuals, are born that way, that it's a biological thing. And that's been a change that's happened, really in the course of your lifetime. So, this is pretty new. Pretty. It shows that we're starting to take science more seriously. I think that's one thing that's a very good thing here, is that we're starting to understand the science of our own selves better. And if we do that, then maybe we'll make better decisions in other areas too. Okay, so when we're talking about homosexuality and sexuality in general, there's a lot of, there are many different directions in which we could go. One thinker I think I should introduce, and, you can read him and then maybe, move on. He was very popular from like the 1970s through today. I would say perhaps too popular, maybe. But anyway, his name was Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher, and he was famous for, back in the 1950s and 1960s, looking at different types of oppression. So he was gay, and back at this time, most people who were talking about oppression were Marxists, and they were talking about the government or capitalism. And Foucault was not really a Marxist. He saw, yes, capitalism could be oppressive and governments could be oppressive, but so could your doctor, and so could the insane asylum, as they were often called at that time, and things like this. And so he wrote this book, Madness and Civilization: A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. And what his whole excuse me, his whole approach then became focused on trying to look at the ways in which normal, kind of developed. He wasn't a symbolic interactionist, but what he was doing was basically symbolic interactionism. But kind of looking at it from a conflict perspective, trying to understand, okay, you have these different institutions throughout society. How do they control our behavior? And it's not so much a clear sort of government top-down way of controlling our behavior, but it's still, the medical clinic, educational institutions, mental health clinics. He saw these as different types of institutions that nonetheless also controlled our behavior. He wrote a couple of important books, that's why I'm bringing him up, on the history of sexuality. Now, I should say that these are not exhaustive histories of sexuality. And if you're looking for, deeper, more cross-cultural histories of sexuality, there are other books. What he did though in these two volumes though was he kind of attacked the notion that was popular at the time. Excuse me. And that notion was that back in the Victorian times, the Victorian era, the late 1800s, where you have these ideas of Victorian morality, the sense of prudishness, that sexuality was something that was repressed, and so on. And he said, no, that's not actually the case. If anything, societies became more obsessed with sexuality than ever before. Maybe, in the 18th and 19th centuries, all of a sudden sexuality becomes this topic of research. You have scientists getting together and talking about sexuality, which they hadn't really done before. You have Freud coming along and saying, that, people are trying to repress their sexual urges. And, he developed his whole view of the human mind as basically, this approach of human sexuality being repressed by society and so on and so forth. And so Foucault was saying that, our society became extraordinarily obsessed with sexuality in the late 1800s and 1900s. and not just obsessed with sexuality, but obsessed with the norms and what we considered abnormal sexuality to be. Now, if you look at the history of sexual behavior and gender roles, it changes from society to society over time. You see a lot of similarities. You see a lot of differences. You see many instances of men living as women, living as transgendered, and vice versa. And you have different periods of time for existence. For example, you have ancient Greece, where it was common practice for young men to be taught sexual behavior by other older men. This is actually something that we witness in many different warrior cultures. We even still see this today, though it's not an institutionalized practice. Certainly some fraternity hazing and certainly some things like that take on a homoerotic dimension, and so on and so forth. So Foucault was saying that we have all of this going on in our society. It's just that it's institutionalized, and so we think of it as something that happens in the bedroom, when in fact it's permeates our society, and now with advertisements and everything, it's everywhere, and so on and so forth. So there's a picture of Foucault. He went back to the ancient texts and looked at what the Greeks and Romans were saying and compared those to the Victorians and so on and so forth. And just kind of, as I said, you see in the 18 and 1900s, then all of a sudden this huge institutional apparatus develops to try to study sexuality and try to understand what normal sexuality is, and try to, take people who were not normal, who are deemed abnormal, and, lock them away or keep them, figure out conversion therapies and all this sort of stuff that we now know is nonsense. But Foucault said that, we became obsessed with sexuality back in the early 1900s. So Foucault was one of many, many writers who contributed to the emergence of what we might call queer theory now, which looks at, everything from, feminist theory and gay and lesbian rights to transgender rights and issues and so on and so forth, and, really covers a whole range, and it kind of covers sexuality. It's really kind of the social theory of sexuality and sexual gender expression, basically. Like the civil rights movement, there have been moments in the gay rights movement where you've seen sort of those pivotal moments that happen. So one happened in New York and the Stonewall riots, where you had one of the first times that you had gay protesters, in a large group that was put down violently by the police. And, this was, as, we think of the 1960s, perhaps maybe in this sort of like liberal, everything was just revolutionary back then. And it actually was not that way. Most people were not very revolutionary. There were definitely a lot of, revolutionary activity and things like this. But for the most part, it was far less revolutionary than our popular imagination, might like to paint it otherwise as. So these were, some very, very brave protesters that put themselves on the front lines of this movement. In the 1990s, you get, and I still remember this, the Defense of Marriage Act, which basically defined marriage as same-sex relationship. Basically, heterosexual family, is the only thing that was recognized by the Supreme Court. So this was a big blow to the gay rights movement, and this was at a time where you had a Democratic president, and people just kind of thought that it would be a really long time, if ever, that gay marriage was legalized. So what DOMA did was it permitted states to ban all recognition of same-sex marriages. So it didn't necessarily do it nationally it didn't, allowed states to do it, so, basically. So that's why you saw states enact gay marriage legislation at different times over the last few years. So really kind of like the civil rights movement, you get a number of court cases that begin to chip away at DOMA. And you get a number of also just legislation in Congress and government action that kind of starts to recognize gay rights as being sort of fundamental rights that should be covered by the Constitution. And again, as I said, attitudes begin to change. So again, this is looking, around when I was born, back there in the 1980s, where, this is saying a question asking back then, do you have any friends, relatives, or coworkers who have told you personally that they are gay or lesbian? Very few, just, not even a quarter of the population said that. By 2013, almost 80% of Americans knew someone who had told them that they were gay or lesbian. So a huge change, and that means that people have become more comfortable in revealing that information about themselves. So you see the changes here, back in 2003, 55% of Americans were opposed to gay marriage. By 2014, basically just 10 years later, that's down to 34%, and you have, even more people supporting it. So it's really incredible how rapidly things can change, as we're seeing with coronavirus. But even in terms of social attitudes, things can change quite dramatically, quite quickly. In terms of kind of looking at the different generations, so your generation is not included here. You're, quite. I guess you'd be considered millennials here. Technically you're Gen Z now, but you see the differences by generation. But every generation has gone up quite substantially. So only 18% of people in my grandparents' generation supported gay marriage back in 2004, almost 40% by 2015. In 2004, that was the year that I graduated college, 44%, so less than half of millennials. That's over 73% now. So major changes, but big changes by generation as well. Okay, so talked about DOMA already. The big change then, that the other ruling, the one that really kind of made gay marriage legal, was Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. And that basically made it legal for all states to allow gay marriage, and that's been the law of the land since then. So this requires that all states are able to do that. That was quite a monumental day for human liberty in the United States, and it's it seems like it was a long time ago, and it was just 5 years ago. We know that we have also there's still a lot of discrimination, so we've had to pass laws that would protect LGBTQ workers from discrimination in the workplace. And we still need a lot of work to do in that area. And for some reason, the text isn't showing up on the slides there. But anyway, parental rights. So this is another area where a lot of progress is being made in terms of adoption for gay parents, and you're seeing some more of this action happening. Hate crimes, as I said, a number of these are are laws that were passed that were basically kind of whittling away at the discriminatory laws against LGBTQ people. So, you know, it's rarely just a one-time thing. You know, usually it's a whole series of events that have to happen before, you know, the liberatory moment happens. You know, slavery didn't just end when Lincoln got elected and signed, you know, signed a law. There had to be a war before we got to that point. And even then, you ended slavery, but you had segregation going on legally for another 100 years. So these struggles do take time. The next big struggle when it comes to gender is transgender rights. And here it's, again, this is an area where it is complex. And I think both proponents of transgender rights and people that are uncomfortable with it, you know, both need to kind of take a step back, breathe a little bit, because it is complex. One of the things that people need to think about is teenagers who may feel that they are transgender and want a sex change therapy or some sort of gender therapy like that. There's some data showing that that's probably not a good idea, that you probably want to wait till you're like 18 to 20, 21, when you've sort of figured out your identity. I say that because we're starting to see research where kids will have a sex change operation or something in their teens and then regret it in their early 20s as their sort of identity has formed more. But, you know, as I said, there's, you know, a lot of complex stuff in that regard. But when we talk about transgender rights in general, we have made a lot of progress there. And, you know, I think there's, you know, definitely more progress that needs to be made, because the reality is that even though transgender people have become very prominent in our culture, in pop culture, you know, they're less prominent in terms of other areas of society. And the reality is that, you know, I mean, it's good that we're seeing them in, you know, in commercials, in shows, as characters on TV, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, for a lot of transgender people, life is still very, very hard. Most have attempted suicide, have been rejected by their families, have experienced some sort of homelessness, and so on and so forth. So a lot of challenges there. Again, when we talk about suicide, you know, this is a population that's, you know, disproportionately is at risk for things like suicide. But as I said, we've made tremendous progress in these areas. You know, and I think, you know, as we move forward, and it will just take a lot of, you know, compromise and understanding to sort of reach that point where we have a better understanding of ourselves and our own sexuality. So I will sort of end it there. As I said, I'll be posting a video on the Kinsey report, which was major research on American sexual behavior done in the 1950s that was basically, you know, kind of laid out our understanding of sexuality for excuse me, for many years and many decades. So I'll post that in the modules, and then I'll post another video for Wednesday, and that will be an interview with Christakis, the author of Connected, about COVID-19 and social networks and all of that. So I think that'll be important, and that'll give me some time to kind of, you know, I'm kind of reworking my lecture on healthcare to adjust to this new healthcare situation that we're in. So, you know, we're approaching the end. You know, just hang in there, everyone. I know, you know, you're facing a lot of adversity, and, you know, we're all facing a lot of adversity right now, and, you know, just, you know, hang in there, and, you know, just, well, as I think I've said before, we'll just try to muddle through the best we can. All right, everyone, I will see you later this week.